Hello, good morning. Welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna. I hope this is going out correctly, as it has just once again has jarred and not gone out correctly the first time. So hopefully you can see and hear me now. So welcome to this week's episode number 212, Further Stories from the Wick Society collection. My name is Lorna Steele-McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service, which has 4 archive centres in the Highlands of Scotland, where we look after historic and current documents relating to this part of the world. We have an archive centre in Wick, one in Fort William, one in Portree, and one in Inverness. And this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in the series. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're really grateful for that. So welcome to this week's episode. We are returning to a wonderful, diverse and extensive collection held at Nucleus, Nuclear and Caithness Archives, the records of the Wick Society, which we last looked at episode number 171 back in January 2024. So we're revisiting this collection to find some more stories in it. And of course, my thanks go to the team at Nucleus, who have provided me, as they always do, with wonderful content and suggestions of readings and extracts and things. So I'm really grateful to them for that. This, as you may remember, is a large collection of records, over 100 boxes, as well as maps and plans, and it covers a very wide range of dates. It dates from 1476 through to the present day. And these were records that have been collected by the Wick Society and then deposited with us for their preservation. It's a real treasure trove, this collection, of material relating to the history and the people of Caithness and Wick in particular. And we're really delighted that Wick Society have put it into our care. And because it's such a broad collection, it has 37 sub-fonds, which is 37 kind of sub-collections underneath it. We're taking another look at it. So today we're looking at WS8, which is the Pulteneytown Estate, WS20, the National Independent Order of Oddfellows, WS31, the John O'Groat Steam Laundry, 32, Mowatt's Garage, 33, the Wick Women's Cooperative Guild, and WS35, Papers of the Stalker Family. So that selection should give you a bit of an idea of the range in this collection. There are papers of businesses, families, organisations, societies, individuals, all sorts of things. So we're going to start with WS8, the Pulteneytown Estate Papers, and some notes and research compiled by my colleague Jen. Pulteneytown Estate was first viewed out to the British Fisheries Society in 1803 by Benjamin Dunbar, with subsequent contracts granted after. It was then passed to Benjamin's son-in-law, Garden Duff Dunbar of Hempriggs, and she's put in big letters to me, this is not a spelling mistake, his name was Garden Duff Dunbar of Hempriggs. The British Fisheries Society decided to sell their part of the estate, and it was bought in 1892 by John Usher. In 1904 it was passed to his son Robert Usher, and then to his son Ronald Usher. So a bit of a kind of quick overview of the ownership of who has had sway over the Pulteneytown estate. But in 1893, at a meeting of the Commissioners of the Borough of Pulteneytown, it was decided to celebrate the first visit to Pulteneytown by John Usher since he had bought the estate in 1892. And this document in the Wick Society papers records the plans that they made for John Usher's first visit to his estate that he had purchased. And as Jen said, it very much reads like they wanted to be on his good side. So this is what they decide to do for John Usher's arrival into Pulteneytown Estate. It was agreed to celebrate this occasion in a suitable manner, and the Commissioners recommend the following. First, by an address of congratulation and welcome. Second, by a display of flags and banners throughout the town. Third, by a procession of the commissioners, viewers and various public bodies, including the Wick Town Council, the Harbour Trust, the School Board and others. Fourth, by a procession being preceded by a band and flag, and that a triumphal arch be erected at the boundary of Pontney Town, where Mr. Usher will first enter into his estate. It was also decided that at the end of all of that procession and all of those flags and banners and parades and people who are attending playing music, that there would be a cake and wine banquet held at the end of that procession. So as Jen said, you really get the feeling that they want to be on the good side of the new estate owner. Now, once in possession, and presumably once all the cake and wine had been eaten, John Usher was keen to understand the state of the place that he'd acquired, and he arranged for a survey of all the estate fencing and the kind of looking at how the infrastructure of the estate was working. So he arranged for a survey of all the estate fencing, with a report to be issued by Alexander Robertson and Sons, ironmongers of Wick. And that's a report that we now have in the collection. And it's interesting to read documents like this because they give an insight into land and estate management, the priorities when you're running an estate. Quite nice to get those things at the moment of takeover, where someone is sort of early on in their time going, right, what am I dealing with here? But as well as that, these documents often give the name of businesses and individuals, which can be really invaluable for people researching their family history or local history. And sometimes these are the documents that are found within collections like this, one or two passing references in a document that will explain why something was done the way it was and why now there might be ramifications within the landscape, and we can see why those decisions were taken. So what did Alexander Robertson and Sons report back to Mr. Usher? The fencing along the Bray Head is in a very bad condition, and besides being nearly useless as a fence, it is in many places dangerous through the wires being broken and dangling about on the path. Although some fences were in slightly better condition, it was found that none of them had been erected properly, and Alexander Robertson then recommended that some fencing on the estate be removed entirely and replaced with new, while other parts of the fencing could be repaired, replaced where necessary, and that the posts that were removed could be used for firewood. On one section of the estate, at the north side of the seaside of the quarry, the path had fallen, meaning that there was no place to anchor the new fence to, and so it was suggested that the path and fencing be moved inwards to accommodate the change in the land. So again, you just sort of get an idea of the way the estate is changing and moving. So that reference there, sorry, I'm still not quite back to normal. That reference there about the part of the estate that leans on the seaside of the quarry. The estate quarries are mentioned again in this collection, in this sub-series of records within the Wick Society. So for instance, this story. In 1937, a letter was written to the factor for Pontney Town estate from the Secretary of the Harbour Trustees, saying that a contractor called William Dunnett had asked for permission to quarry stones in the Trustees' quarry at the South Head for the expansion of Wick High School, subject to getting permission from the proprietor of Pontney Estate, who he said he would also pay a quarry rent to. However, it was then discovered that he was quarrying stones for use in other buildings, not just for the high school extension, and the Harbour Trustees began looking into the matter, as they had only agreed that the stone could be used for the school and not for any other buildings. And there's quite a lot of correspondence that follows this discovery between D.W. Georgeson, the Wick Harbour Trust's Trustees Secretary, and Mackenzie and Black on behalf of the Pontney Town estate, regarding the quarrying on the estate, who had the rights to quarry, what exactly did those rights permit or forbid. And Jen summarised what the conclusion of this was. The Harbour Trustees had the right to take stones from certain quarries at the South Head and use of the roadways leading to them from the harbour for the purposes of repairing and maintaining the harbour, its road and quays. They did not own the quarries they used or have any say in who else used the stone. William Dunnett had also been unaware of this when he approached them to use the stone of their quarries for the extension of the high school. He also had a separate lease from the proprietor of Pontney Town Estates to open a new quarry at Dogshaven and to make a new road to it, which he would use to gather stones for his other construction projects. It was concluded, therefore, that Mr. Dunnett was correct in where he had quarried, although apparently he didn't follow the regulations and he didn't always warn before blasting in the quarry, but also it was agreed that the harbour trustees had overstepped their authority in trying to grant permission to the quarried stone when they didn't have the right to do that within their agreement. So those extracts talk about land use and the quarry and where stone has come from for buildings that may or may not still exist. And again, they reference different organisations, different businesses that existed and who had a say in those decisions. But some of the subfonds within the Wick Society collection don't make passing reference to businesses. They're entirely about specific businesses and specific organisations. So if we look next at WS31 and WS32, the records of the John O'Groat Steam Laundry and Mowat's Garage, respectively. WS31 contains the records of the John O'Groat Steam Laundry. Based in Newton Road in Wick, the laundry was established in around 1912 and remained in business until the 1990s. So if you're watching this in Wick or in Caithness, then you may well remember the laundry. WS31 covers the years 1911 to 1988, and it includes the records of this business, including invoices and accounts, cash books, wages books, ledgers, banking records, correspondence and plans. And Val gave me some of her thoughts about cataloguing the John O'Groat Steam Laundry collection. She noted that the wage books from 1925 to 26 reveal, perhaps unexpectedly, that the employees are predominantly women and that they average a 9-hour day, 6 days a week. So that is a long working week in a hot, steamy, arduous, heavy lifting kind of job. But she found that it was also common for the women to work 11-hour days over their 6 days, which meant that they often worked nearly 70 hours every week, which kind of makes me feel bad for being very tired for my 37-hour usual week. And yes, they were doing traditional laundry, but a ledger from 1927 to 1937 posed Val some questions about what else was happening within the business. The ledger had no title and no details of what it was for, and it was full of entries listing people's names, their address, and things such as runner or carpet with a price attached to it. And after deciding that the prices were too low to be sales, Val concluded tentatively that the ledger was maybe looking at the costs for carpet cleaning. And then that was proved correct when later on in the cataloguing process she came across a plan that showed the laundry's layout, and it did indeed have a carpet beating room. I don't know how common that was within a laundry. We kind of tend to associate people with beating their carpets at home. So interesting that they had an entire carpet beating room. But of course most of the work that laundry was doing is laundering of clothes and linen. And if we look at WS31-2, we find some correspondence from September 1939 to and from the officer commanding the RAF station at Wick. And he was inquiring into the cost of doing laundry for the airmen. And it did make me smile. So they were quoted 1 and 6 to do a dozen laundry single sheets, 9p for a dozen pillow slips, bolster slips or hand towels, and 4p each for overalls. And they were also quoted 11p for a bundle of airman's washing, which comprised 1 shirt, 1 towel, 2 collars, 2 pairs of socks, 1 vest and 1 pair of drawers, is how it's listed. But it's an interesting wee glimpse into a very local level of a business, something happening in a comparatively small area in the run-up on the brink of global upheaval and meltdown, that the RAF are writing to this business to get some of their materials washed, some of their clothes washed. September 1939, they are just on the edge of going into something which would undoubtedly impact all of them. Another business represented in this collection is Mowat's Garage, and Anne sent me this overview of those records which form WS32, and also her thoughts about some of the items within the Mowat's Garage collection. Mowat's Garage was founded by William John Mowat, born 1892, in 1919 in Alexander Place, Wick. The business moved to larger premises in George Street in 1930, where it remained until 2003. So a lot of these records that are in the Wick Society, a lot of the organisations, the businesses, have those early roots, but they closed really recently. So a lot of them are still in the memory of the communities. Mowatt's were agents for Ford, Standard Triumph and Esso Fuel. The garage sold, serviced and repaired motor vehicles. In 1952, William J. Mowat was joined by his sons Donald and William and his daughter Minnie in the business, which also ran a taxi service, along with the agency for Hillman, Humber and Sunbeam cars and Nuffield tractors. After the death of William Mowat Sr. in 1963, his sons took control of the business with the Roots Group agencies and then Chrysler Talbot, which later became Peugeot. All sorts of interesting things for people who are interested in the history of cars here. For many years before the opening of the ambulance depot in Wick, the Mowat brothers were the contractors for the ambulance service, running this out of the garage. In the 1980s, the Mowats also purchased the firm of Kirkhill Motors in Green Road, Wick, where they carried on the business for about 10 years until its closure, when the site was sold for housing. After the retirement of Donald Mowat, William and his wife Brenda ran the business, and after her death, William continued to serve Caithness motorists with Peugeot cars and Shell motor fuels, making him one of the longest held Peugeot dealerships in the United Kingdom. On William's retirement in 2003, the premises in George Street were sold to the Caithness Tyre Company. But then Anne goes on to say, amongst the collection are paraffin and stores books, which give a fascinating insight into all the little necessities that the local garage would have stocked. Paraffin, of course, had many and varied uses in decades gone past and was created in around 1830. Small paraffin heaters would have been in common use, and paraffin lamps. It was added to cleaning solutions and used for cleaning greasy engine components. So there's all of these items that you can see in this collection that are being sold at the garage, which are not only to do with cars, they're to do with everyday life within the community. But Anne says, some of the most interesting items for me are the descriptions and prices of the new cars and the job card book. The job card book includes pages and pages of local cars with SK number plates, which would be very sought after now. And a look through the descriptions of the new cars records that you had to pay extra to have a heater in your Ford Consul in the 1950s, but that you would get pretty good miles per gallon for your Talbot Horizon at 44 miles per gallon. So again, interesting the things different people pull out when they're looking at these records. But it's not just businesses that we are looking at today, so I'm going to move on now to look at some of the club and society records within the Wick Society collection. WS20 comprises the records of the National Independent Order of Oddfellows, the Wick branch. And here are Belinda's notes about this series of records. The Oddfellows Society is a friendly society with branches across Britain. It was officially set up to protect and care for its members at a time when there was no welfare state, no trade unions and no National Health Service. The aim was to provide help to members whenever they needed it, and we can see in the records of this collection and in the records of the Oddfellows generally that this would include medical support and support in paying for funeral expenses. Legend says that the Oddfellows fraternity has roots going back as far as 587 BC, with the exile of the Israelites in Babylon. There you go. Legend says. It is said to have continued amongst Jewish prisoners who were taken to Rome during the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD and was recognised by Emperor Titus Caesar. However, the exact date of the first founding of the Oddfellows Fellowship is not known, with some historians believing it to have its roots in the 12th or 13th century medieval trade guilds. The records that do exist place it in the 18th century, with the earliest surviving printed official lodge record said to be the Rules of Loyal Aristocrats. You can correct me on that. Lodge number 9 in England, dated 12th of March 1748. Some 50 years later, in 1797, the government would make such societies illegal, with the government being suspicious of societies that administer oaths and correspond by signs and passwords. This was perhaps triggered by the French Revolution, but it caused societies such as the Oddfellows to go underground and in effect to become the secret societies, the very thing that the government feared and didn't want to happen. The signs and passwords created during this period are still used today. This illegal status would remain until 1851, when it was overturned, as branch-friendly societies were declared legal. However, this was not before 6 men, termed the Tolpero Martyrs, in 1834, were persecuted and sent to Australia as punishment for being members of a friendly society and swearing an oath. This caused some panic among many members of the Oddfellows, being reminded of their illegal status as members. Although all 6 men were eventually pardoned some years later, after a petition was signed by 800,000 and a march staged by their supporters, they were returned to the UK. There is still an annual march to remember this event. Something for you to research, Jen. The term Independent Order of Oddfellows came into existence in 1810, when a group of dissatisfied members in Manchester broke away from the guild and established themselves as an independent. By 1814, they had established elected officers and standardised the work of the lodges, and this leads us to the National Independent Order of Oddfellows Wick branch, which forms part of the Wick Society collection. According to a John O'Groat Journal article that was published in 1904, the Wick branch of Oddfellows had been formed 18 years ago, so that puts it to around 1886. And if we look at WS20, it's made up of only 4 items. 2 statements of receipts and expenditure from 1904 and 1907, and some minutes. So it's not a huge amount, but we can still use these documents, as few as they are, to glean information that we don't have elsewhere. It is further evidence of the group's existence and some of the things that we did. And I was really fascinated by the way Belle put together some of these notes for me with things that she felt we could learn just from these 4 items. So for instance, we can learn that the Wick branch went by the name the Loyal St Eyre's Lodge number 1099 in Wick, and that they were part of the Inverness district. We can also then take that information and search across all of our collections. And then doing that, we find a picture of the members that was taken by the famous Johnson photographers in around 1920. And we can get that by using the fact that we know it's the Loyal St Eyre's Lodge. So we can then find a fantastic picture of the Oddfellows in around 1920. The wonderful Johnson collection, which I have spoken about before, also has 3 more photos of the members from the 1890s, and some pictures of individual members of the Oddfellows too, where names are known. It was common for each lodge to have its own medical officer and surgeon, and these 4 items that we have tell us that Wick's surgeon was Dr. Samuel Elliot. And again, taking that one piece of information and then using it to search across our collections, we find that the first medical officer of the Bignell Hospital in Caithness was Dr. Elliot, recorded in the volume Amulets and Isotopes, A History of Medicine in Caithness, which I used a few weeks ago. If we then take Dr. Samuel Elliot's name and search beyond our own collections, and we have a look on the British Newspaper Archive, then we find a newspaper report of the Oddfellows social gathering in Wick in Caithness 1903, and that comes up because Dr. Elliot is thanked for his service and his commitment to the health of the members. And that gathering, the Christmas gathering, it sounds like an absolute riot. It said it was most successful. It says that on previous occasions, the Oddfellows of Wick had invited members of the public into their Christmas gatherings, but it had been so popular that they now couldn't find a big enough hall, and so this year they'd had to make it members and family only. And it does sound like a really jolly gathering. It describes large numbers of children who were in attendance, playing games, there was food, there was entertainment. It describes all the fun that the children are having, and the older members and the members of the Oddfellows standing around the outside of the room taking great delight in watching the children having fun. There was also dancing that went on till 4 a.m. And it's not only Dr. Eliot's name which appears in these 4 items, we also find out the names in those 1904 and 1907 documents of the trustees, of the chaplain, the treasurer, the secretary, and the honorary members. So then using those, which might just be one sheet of paper, but using that, the information we can get from there, we can dig further into each of those people. And that sheds light on a huge amount of aspects of Wick life, because as always, as I've said many a time before, it tends to be the same people who are involved in running things. The same people might be involved in the church and the poor relief system and the town council and things like that. So for example, GEO Green, who is recorded as an honorary member of the Oddfellows, went on to become Wick's chief magistrate. And it's a really great example of how much can be discovered from even the smallest collection. And as I've said so many times, the limit on what our collections can tell us it's only limited by what we ask them. So if we look in different ways at a very small collection like that, we can start to tease out information. Another group whose records form part of the Wick Society collection are the women's, I'll try that again. There's another group represented within this collection, and that is the Wick Cooperative Women's Guild, which started in April 1945. And it was part of the Cooperative Women's Guild established in 1883 by working class women in the cooperative movement to provide representation and spread cooperation in communities where women were traditionally a big part of the workforce. Really interesting, because this organisation is by the working class for the working class, as opposed to being something by the middle class done for the working class, if that makes sense. So it's notable in that respect that this is a group of women who are working women, and their focus is on issues that affect women. So things like suffrage, maternity rights, family planning. And here are some extracts from the Wick branch's minute books from 1958 of WS 33, some extracts that Val selected. 18th of February 1956. Another year has dawned as we meet in the guild room on this occasion, and we all step into the unknown with our hopes and fears, trusting in God's great mercy for 1956. Very poetic way to open a meeting, isn't it? Mrs. Davidson said how pleased she was to see such a large gathering on such a stormy night, the usual guild weather never too stormy to keep us away. She wished everyone a very happy new year, and said it gave her great pleasure to call on our speaker and demonstrator, another old friend, Mrs. Appleyard. We have had many speakers in the guild, all very good, but I think our evening with Mrs. Appleyard was just about the best, both in her display of lovely hand embroidery, knitted dolls, stitched bags, and most interesting of all, aprons made out of her bit box. I am quite sure every one of us made a New Year's resolution to have a bit box for 1956 and no more dusters of what could be a good apron. Mrs. Appleyard, in her very able and very witty talk in her own Yorkshire tongue, made the time fly, and it was time for tea again, always a welcome break. 18th of July 1956. This was a very pleasant meeting of members. At 2 p.m. we met in the South School to go on our annual picnic. Being very fortunate in the weather after so many bad days, we set off for John O'Groats, 2 busloads in great form. We stopped at John O'Groats for half an hour and then proceeded to Thurso, many having friends to visit, others going different places for tea. At 6 o'clock we met to go to Dounreay, which all members very much enjoyed. We were taken right down to as near the work as was permissible. We saw the men leaving the job and rushing for the buses. It really was a great eye-opener to those of us who had heard so much about the work being done and the crowds. From there we proceeded home by Leibster after a very pleasant afternoon and evening. 56 members travelled in 2 buses, tickets being 10 shillings each, including tips and tea. It makes you want to go out and join a society, I think. The Wick branch closed in February 2002, and then the whole Cooperative Women's Guild ceased to exist in 2016 after 133 years of campaigning, working for and representing women's rights. So we've looked at estates and businesses and societies, and I'm going to finish by looking at something really different again, just to illustrate the breadth of this collection. WS35 contains the papers of the Stalker family, and here's Val's research into that family. George Stalker was born on the 19th of May 1848 in Kincardine Parish in Perthshire. Charlotte Simpson was born on the 24th of May 1851 in Stroma, Canas Bay Parish. She was a sewing mistress, presumably in Stroma School, where she met George Stalker. George and Charlotte were married in 1873 in Stroma. They had children Margaret, John, James, Elizabeth, David, Hugh, Annie, Robert and William, so at least 9. George became head teacher of Auchengill School, and the family lived at the schoolhouse there. He was appointed on the 17th of December 1877 after leaving Stroma Society School, where he was head teacher from 1870. He retired at the age of 65 in December 1912 and was replaced by his daughter Lizzie. Lizzie attended both Keith and Auchengill schools and subsequently became a pupil teacher. She went on to study at the West End School of Cookery in Glasgow, and in this collection are her notebooks containing her studies of cooking, knitting, sewing and household management. And these are fascinating. Val sent me some extracts over to look at, and they're just so full of detail. Things like what the cleaning schedule would be for a small house. So what you should do on a Monday, what you should do on a Friday afternoon, what should be done every day, how often fires should be cleaned out, how often linen should be changed, all of that kind of thing. And then another one looking at budgeting and household management, that she had broken into the way a working class family should allocate their income, the way a middle class family should, what percentage should be spent on rent or food or bills. Just really interesting. Lizzie became a member of the Educational Institute of Scotland in 1906 and commenced as assistant teacher at Keith School in 1907 and then becoming head teacher of Auchengill School in 1912 after her father retired. Lizzie's brother, Robert McCallan Stalker, was born in 1891. He was educated at Auchengill School, Wick High and St Andrews University. In 1915, he joined the 5th Battalion Seaforth Highlanders as a second lieutenant before transferring to the Royal Flying Corps as a lieutenant observer in 22 Squadron. The RFC was the air arm of the British Army from 1912 to 1918, which would merge with the Royal Naval Air Service to become the Royal Air Force. And Robert was killed in action on the 8th of September 1916, shot down over Fleur during the Battle of the Somme. Lieutenant Ainan Bowen was the pilot, with Robert as the observer. And he's remembered on the Arras Flying Services Memorial at the Pas de Calais in France. And this collection of family papers, it includes certificates, exercise books, photographs, records of this family, means that these individuals, Lizzie and Robert and their parents and all the siblings, that those people and the contribution that they made live on long beyond their own lifetimes. So I hope you've enjoyed another look at this very diverse collection which tells so many stories of Wick and Caithness's past. Many, many thanks to my colleagues in Nucleus for doing so much of the heavy lifting for this one for me, particularly when I'm still not feeling 100%. It makes such a difference to me. So I hope you have enjoyed that. I hope you can join me next week, where we will be looking at the subject of Gaelic in our collections as part of World Gaelic Week. It'll be pre-recorded because I'm going to be in a school talking about Jacobites, but I hope you can join me for that nonetheless. A reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer, that High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we are very grateful for that. Thank you for all your comments, and even if I don't see them at the time, I come back and see them afterwards. So thank you so much for all your messages. See you next week.